Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, good morning and welcome to Politics with Sam and Anne, the podcast that gives you everything you need to know about the day ahead in politics in under 20 minutes.
It's a promise. Good morning. It's Tuesday, February the 25th. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. With me is Sam Coates of Sky News.
It's a somewhat curious time in UK politics, I thought. First day back from recess yesterday, and I was wandering around the Houses of Parliament last night, the Commons and the big portcullis house and the bars and all the rest of it. And it struck me as somewhat deserted and energyless. It's quite clear that the effort and the spotlight is elsewhere in politics, not on domestic policy, not on MPs. And I went last night, Anne, to the newly reopened Strangers Bar. You'll remember it had been closed after a sort of spiking incident, and it's been reopened with a series of measures. There's CCTV, there are doormen on the door with clickers to count how many people can come in. And in a sign of just the shift in culture in Parliament, and I wonder if you could make it any less welcoming, according to the people there, within a week or two, if you want to buy a drink, you're actually going to have to swipe your parliamentary pass. You're going to have to touch your parliamentary pass in order to buy a drink. And the MPs I was talking to was absolutely aghast. They said, well, you'll know exactly what we've purchased, and you, Sam, will be able to FOI kind of who are the biggest drinkers in Parliament. How can we possibly continue hanging out here in a way that it was? And there was just that sense of a kind of a parliamentary institution crumbling, along with this second sense that the action was out there. Would you go to a bar where you had to sort of place an ID card on a register and register what you've been drinking?
Well, I have had to do that, actually, because if you go in lots of countries across the Middle East that allow alcohol, you do have to do that when you go into a hotel, and sometimes take a picture of your passport. So I sort of empathise with the MPs on this one. It is very strange because, as you say, you from the moment you get in, then you feel that everything you then order is obviously going somewhere into some file. I guess I hear what you're saying, but of course, that does appear to have been a serious incident, and I suppose looking like you're not responding to it, particularly given that Parliament has a reputation for being a less welcoming, or historically being less welcoming to women. They've probably kind of overshot, Sam, in trying to show that they're serious and doing something about it, that that there is monitoring. But it's quite odd, isn't it, that the one group of people who are going to be treated in this way, in a society in which we do have alcohol in many and most settings where adults are MPs. Everybody else is sort of trusted to get on with it broadly, and that we should be risk aware where we should be, but it's MPs who are being subjected to this.
Talking to MPs who did make it through the security barriers and past the guards, it's clear that that they feel like passengers rather than drivers at this moment in politics, because of everything that's going on with Ukraine and in America, and the fact that British politics is actually taking place in different stages around the world. And this means that what they're commenting on and what they were all talking about last night was which are the loudest voices that they're paying attention to. And that takes us, I think, to our main theme this morning, which was talking to MPs on the Tory side. There are just increasingly sort of nerves and worries about whether or not the principal opposition in this country is making enough of a song and dance of what it needs to, and grabbing enough of the attention that it needs to, or whether or not there are others, Nigel Farage or even Boris Johnson, who are more successful at grabbing the limelight and setting the agenda than Kemi Badenoch's party. So we talk about this in the context today of a big speech, her first big speech on foreign affairs by the Conservative Party leader. But we are at a moment where when you look at the papers this morning, in some of them, there's frankly more coverage to Boris Johnson's comments out in Ukraine yesterday, where he was talking about how it was ghastly to hear the Ukrainian president, the comments about the Ukrainian president by Donald Trump, and condemning his complete untruths, but saying that he needed to be optimistic in Kyiv and Washington, and an economic partnership could benefit both sides. Boris also going on about how the UK needed to boost defence spending to 3%. Big, clear messages from a former Tory leader, with quite a lot of them worrying in advance of the speech today that they hadn't heard the same kind of primary colours language from their own leader, and just a little bit of a sense that Boris was showing how Kemi Badenoch could do it.
Interesting. Also, I'm all about the deep dives here. So I just happened to notice that Carrie Johnson, Boris's wife, was back on Instagram talking about their holiday in the Red Sea and Saudi Arabia. Quite a lot of detail, and it was back to those images of the Johnsons as this tribe that you have to be interested in. You're supposed to be interested in where they went on holiday and do they look adorable at the beach, and it was a bit of a throwback for me, because those were the days, the Stardust days of Boris Johnson and family. I always think, and this may be me being a little sceptical, that these things don't happen without some sort of thinking of Boris behind it. He likes to be back in the limelight, so we wonder what he means by that, as must Kemi Badenoch, as must everyone who's ever worked alongside Boris Johnson.
Now, all of this against the backdrop of Kemi's speech. So this morning, she's going to the sort of the news point that the Conservative Party are trying to drive home from this speech is that Britain must be prepared to disengage from international courts and institutions that have been taken over by activists and autocratic regimes. So a kind of strong hint there, but not a definitive statement, that Kemi Badenoch may eventually end up pulling out of the European Convention in Human Rights, and also a sort of extended passage, which is part of one of her main themes of her leadership, about we have to be realistic about the state of the nation, about the state of British politics and the ability of politicians to get things done. Overnight, the Conservatives released quite a big extract from the speech, which is taking place mid-morning this morning. I want to ask you about the policy in it in just a second, Anne. But the biggest thing that strikes me again about Kemi Badenoch's speech, as the last speech did, is just how depressing it is. So set against and contrasted with Boris Johnson's words from yesterday, which, despite some of the criticism of Donald Trump and some of the worries about President Zelensky, still nevertheless absolutely resolutely manages to strike an upbeat note and an optimistic note about the future. You just have to look at some of Kemi Badenoch's language, which sort of slightly, it doesn't leave you feeling good about the world. She talks about how Britain used to hide behind vapid statements that were at best ambitious 20 years ago, but are now outright irrelevant. She talks about how we've been fooled into believing that international law alone can keep the peace. She's saying that the world has changed, but we are not ready. Whenever she gives her diagnosis, she thinks that Britain is ready for this cold, sharp shock of realism for which she will be respected. But I do worry that the downbeat nature of those kinds of messages, that complete absence of optimism that it can feel like when listening to her, just makes it harder for her to get her messages across, and less possible for people to sort of empathise and sympathise with the leadership, who themselves just see problems everywhere, and no sense of sunny uplands.
It does remind me of the old Russian saying that the beatings will continue until morale improves. I think that it's a meaty speech here by Kemi Badenoch, but it does have that kind of finger wagging to it, and I think you've really put your finger on it. I should say I kind of do understand what she's saying, and I think she's trying to say, yes, it's all right for Keir Starmer doing his shuttle diplomacy. But look, he's a lawyer. He always believes in these international law and the systems of international law. She says she doesn't to the same extent, and she thinks that these things have let us down and so often been hijacked, she says, by NGOs, non-governmental organisations, and others with an activist political agenda. But there we go again, Sam. It's always very, very negative. I think what she's tilting at here is that she's dropping hints that she thinks that things like the ECHR, European Convention on Human Rights, which has become such a talking point on the right and opposition to it, that she sees problems with it, and she sees it as being something that lawyers get hung up on. It isn't fit for purpose as ways to solve problems that we face in the real world. But she then doesn't go on and say it, does she? She's always been sort of halfway to saying what people who want to get out want to hear, is that they want to get out, but she's sort of always picking around the criticism. And here she seems, I don't know if you agree with this at all, Sam, but she seems to have nudged one step closer but still not got there.
No, it's got neither fish nor fowl. And I can't help but wonder, Anne, whether or not this isn't just an ever so slight paler imitation of this sort of extraordinary piece that was in The Spectator last week by Michael Gove. Now, Michael Gove, former cabinet minister, now the editor of The Spectator, wrote this thunderous piece last week, which actually he sort of did a bit of a U-turn on some of the bits of his credo of the last 20 years, and did admit, after some self-reflection, that he wasn't quite sure that he was on the right side of history with some elements of liberal interventionism that he'd backed in the past. But as part of that, he said that we needed to be grown up about institutions and be much more realistic about whether or not we remain part of things like the European Convention of Human Rights. A lot of that speech feels like it's reflected in Kemi Badenoch's speech today. Michael Gove, of course, a bit of a mentor to Kemi Badenoch. But it just, that sense that the right is shifting, but she's not necessarily the person leading the shift, but she's following on from others, I don't think is terribly convenient. There is a caucus of people on the right who are pushing much harder for cleaner positions on this stuff, but she can't quite commit herself to going all the way, or do it in quite the terms that Michael Gove did.
Well, a couple of things there. One, Kemi Badenoch really doesn't like to be seen as a protege of Michael Gove. I found that out to my cost when I wrote something like that. So quite interesting about that. She really does believe, that they have had their differences as well, but clearly they are on. I think they're closer now in terms of their outlook than they were, and broadly speaking, the Spectator is supportive. But that's also very Kemi. She doesn't like to be seen to be in any way manipulated or steered by anyone else. She's ferociously independent. I think in some ways for better and worse, that's just one thing. It's so interesting that point, because I think what do we think the commonality is here? If you just look at the state of polling at the moment, we're seeing Reform then staying ahead, indeed consolidating ahead of the Conservatives at about 25% on polls out today. Sam, the Conservatives on 22, and also it was not great for those numbers for Labour either. And what I take from it is everyone in some way is nudging a little bit closer to that kind of reform narrative, or at least reflecting on their previous stances, and maybe they should just tweak this and that, and they'll be a bit like Reform but not quite like Reform. There's a detail about it in Playbook today from my colleague Dan Bloom, who's had a dive on the other side of the balance sheet into how this is affecting morale in Wales and the possible end of Labour's centrally long winning streak in Wales at the hands of Reform as we go into the local elections in May. And it's what's struck me about it, as well as the fact that it's obviously a dreadful mood of Labour in Wales, and this fear that Reform are going to eat their electoral lunch there. But just like how much of a split this is, how angry people are about it on both sides, those who think that they haven't faced up to Reform and those who think that they're going too far. And I think Kemi Badenoch with this speech is trying to deal with that in her own way, with this very strong language. What's the risk? You don't get as far as you hope you're going to get in getting Reform voters, and you just sound a bit cross.
Absolutely. You referenced their polls. Today we've got the YouGov Sky News Times voting intention weekly poll. That puts Reform for the third week in a row in front on 25%, which is actually down 2 on last week. Labour in second on 24, Conservatives third on 22, Lib Dems on 16 and Green on 8. There are a couple of big tests coming up, particularly for the Conservative Party at the hands of Reform. One is the local elections, where Tory MPs think that they could lose half of their seats. And that, I don't think, is expectation lowering. I think that is a genuine belief because they're a bit confused about what the message of the Conservative Party is. And the other is this likely, almost certain by-election that we're going to get in Runcorn after the conviction of Mike Amesbury yesterday. He is appealing, so the button hasn't been pressed on the process that could lead to an election, but it looks bluntly quite likely. Now, the swing in the current polls, if you draw a straight line from today's voting intention poll compared to the general election, takes you near but not quite enough for Reform to take that seat. So if you talk to pollsters, they would say that the uniform national swing of that poll doesn't quite put Reform in front. But, right. We're not that far off. So if that happens, then I think potentially all hell breaks loose, because inside the Conservative Party, the mood is quite fragile. We talked after the first 100 days about the opinion of some Tory MPs canvassing others, that they talk about real fears about Kemi's operation, that words like the arrogance of the operation and the people around her, her complete failure to reach out, her seeming utter confidence in her plan, which involves policy commissions and truth-telling, but an unwillingness to hear the criticism that there is around. And again, I'm getting people talking about the question of whether she will last. And so today is an interesting moment. Can she reset that? Can there be a bit more optimism in the speech, or does this narrative continue to grow? The loudest voices being the most important ones in the room is a theme internationally as well. We had President Macron's visit to the White House yesterday. People have been digesting that. It strikes me, Anne, that we're in this world where you can sort of either go on vibes or you can go on facts at the moment. And the sort of the vibes out of Downing Street last night, I think, were that they were broadly pleased with where President Macron's visit ended up, and Macron himself was talking about the meeting with Trump being a turning point. But I do wonder, when you look at actually what happened yesterday, whether or not this isn't Britain and France slightly overstating it. I mean, you've got this extraordinary spectacle of the US withdrawing its condemnation of Russia's invasion in statements in the Security Council. I mean, in the end, we had the spectacle of the Security Council adopting a US drafted resolution on the third anniversary of Russia's invasion that took a neutral position on the conflict. I mean, incredible. Britain, France, Denmark, Greece and Slovenia all abstained. I mean, Britain does not break from America in the UN almost ever. You had our person in the UN, Barbara Woodward, basically accusing the US of undermining the UN Charter in some very punchy comments that haven't got a great deal of pickup this morning. And the G7 is struggling to struggle to issue any kind of joint statement. That is international institutions crumbling before our eyes.
I mean, this is the ultimate. It's almost like those black swan events that people like to talk about in risk management. And in this risk management, it's clearly absolutely failed. A huge black swan just sailed through the international waters here to be in that position as one of the strongest allies of the US here from the UK perspective is extraordinary. And I'm also very interested in how the leaders are basically... I love your idea of vibes versus facts. Once you put everything through that prism, it comes out quite interesting, doesn't it? So if you want vibes...
I think, by the way, there was quite an interesting Economist article which criticised kind of political journalists for obsessing about vibes versus facts. And I think there's something in that, which is why we're giving you lots of facts on this podcast.
We always give you lots of facts, but there is... I do think vibes matter. I mean, I'm just going to, go out there a bit maybe against that criticism, because I've always sort of felt in very complex situations, sometimes the vibes, the facts change on the ground, but the vibes remain. And the vibes around the Macron charm offensive and his visit to Washington, le big deal, as it is being called. You bet you're pleased you've got a linguist on the show. We've sort of a very funny account of it. I should say, it's a sort of bleak comedy, I should say also, but dear Donald, said Macron, backslapping as he walked through a door, as our colleagues in the Brussels playbook picked up, so that his image was his arm around the back of the president. That must have taken Donald Trump a bit by surprise. So that's what Macron is up to. But then he does, in fairness to Macron, he did speak truth to power and said it's not true that American claim that Europe is not really spending its blood and treasure. We have been spending real money, to be clear, he said. Now, it'll be interesting, I imagine, vibes and facts. I don't think we'll hear Keir Starmer being quite that on the front foot. He tends to use a more diplomatic language. And at the same time, I don't think Friedrich Merz, the new upcoming leader in Germany, is finished yet at all, because he sees this as all a bit of a nonsense and that we're avoiding the hard facts, whereas he sees it is that Europe is on its own, that America has turned its back, and it's better to just say so. So there's three leaders, three very different ways of dealing with Donald Trump.
The one concrete win that people seem to be sort of clinging on to is Donald Trump asserting, and we don't have evidence for this, but Donald Trump asserting that President Putin would be open to a European peacekeeping force being inside Ukraine. Now, first of all, we don't have confirmation of that from Russia. That is a contention of the US president that we yet to see the colour of the money on. But this is something I think that's going to dominate discussion for some time, because it strikes me that such a peacekeeping force is a important bargaining chip this week, but incredibly complicated, because first of all, it only works really, and its composition is dependent on the size of any US guarantee. The bigger the US guarantee, the smaller the peacekeeping force. The relationship between those two, we're not even at the start of working out how it would work. There's a second question about who exactly is this force, Britain, France, and which other countries, but also what umbrella does it come under? President Trump has made clear it can't be NATO. Is it a joint expeditionary force? Is it just Britain and France operating together? It's not clear who's in command. It probably can't be the UN. And thirdly, it literally can't go near the front line, because you can't have UK or French troops engaging with Russian troops, because then that would put us in direct conflict with Russia, and then that would inevitably be incredibly dangerous. So we are talking about this theoretical army. It is not yet clear to me, or some in Whitehall, how real that ever actually becomes. But that is one of the main things that Keir Starmer will take and try and discuss further with President Trump on Thursday, which we'll be talking about. We've hit 20 minutes. And final point from you?
Final point from me would be talking to a congressman close to Donald Trump, who repeatedly in the podcast we'll have out later in the week keeps saying, if you don't, if you're not prepared to contribute more, just shut up. And he keeps saying it again and again. And that's the tone that you get, really quite out there, quite almost rude, really, from some people close to Trump. And I think that peacekeeping idea, you're absolutely right about the complexity, but it's taking something that you're offering. It's a reason why you go to hearing when a lot of people, when words close to it have been saying in the last couple of weeks, you guys in Europe, you've got nothing to say here.
Thank you very much indeed. There'll be more on this tomorrow. We will see you in the morning.
See you then.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.